wow, what do you know? It's time for the Pocket Knife Show. Hey, it's Mike on the mic again for another episode of the Pocket Knife Podcast. For years upon years in the United States, Canada, and a number of European nations, laws were on the books which restricted activities and sales on Sundays. Few of these laws still exist. Most, from what I could tell, are now county or local level ordinances rather than state or nationwide bans. Whatever you think of these blue laws and whether they should still be on the books or not, they are an interesting part of the legal history of Western culture. Many of the regulations passed and enforced in our country had to do with the sale of alcohol on Sundays, but other regulations prohibited certain rude, crude, and socially unacceptable behaviors. A short Google search yielded this old-time list outlining the Sunday laws of Canadian province, Ontario. I'll read a few excerpts from it, since you can't see it. Under the heading, Sunday Laws in Force in the Province of Ontario, is a rundown of the following prohibited actions. This is just some of the list. All farm work, such as seeding, harvesting, fencing, ditching. The work of musicians and paid performers of any kind. Works of necessity and mercy accepted. I'm not sure how you do merciful music, but anyway. All games, races, or other sports for money or prizes, or which are noisy, or at which a fee is charged, and the business of amusement or entertainment. All gambling, tippling, that's another word for drinking publicly, using profane language, and all other acts which disturb the public quiet, all public meetings except in churches, hunting, shooting, fishing. Also, bathing in any public place or in sight of a place of public worship or private residence. The fines for infractions of these laws were set at $1 to $500. I wonder which rule garnered the top penalty. Probably public bathing near a church. Hello, David and Bathsheba. Please understand, I'm not making fun of these laws. They were, I'm sure, passed with the intent of preserving the sanctity of the community's day of worship. Perhaps many in the villages of Ontario were thankful for such a set-aside day. Others were not, and, this is important, their hearts were not changed by the legal restrictions. Some used these laws to judge their worthless neighbors, while those they judged were not moved to worship God by the impositions placed upon them by these laws. In the opening verses of Luke 6, a group of judgmental jerks who could not see past the letter of the law accused Jesus' followers of breaking the Sabbath. Here's what it says. Starting verse 1, One Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Jesus answered them, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Do you remember the all farm work prohibition in the Canadian Sunday laws poster? That's what we're encountering here, to the extreme. What does Jesus think of the accusations leveled against his followers? Not much. He clearly shows from the history of his people that the laws were not always strictly adhered to, and that hunger, which is all the disciples were really guilty of, sometimes requires a seeming violation of the law. I mean, David, who was not a priest, and his men, who were also not priests, ate the bread that was, by law, meant only for priests. And God didn't condemn them. Then Jesus says an astounding thing at the close of verse 5. He says, The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Who's the Son of Man? It's Jesus. Who is in charge of the Sabbath? He is. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He can judge whether someone has violated the Sabbath laws all by himself. Thank you very much. Over the years, I have heard more than my fair share of people judge others in relation to what they do on Sunday. In rural areas, there are some in the church who think it's evil to harvest on Sunday. Those who hold this belief are quick to point fingers at their brothers who don't. Rather than tell you what is the definitive answer to the question of right and wrong here, let me read a few short verses from Paul's letter to the Roman church. Romans 14 talks about some of the disputable matters of his day. After talking about some whose consciences allow them to eat meat and others who can't, he says this about observing the Sabbath. I'm starting at verse 5. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God, and whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives for ourselves alone, and none of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. You then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you treat them with contempt? What's my point in reading this? You are not the judge of your brother's or your sister's actions on Sunday. You do what God has convinced you is right. You let them do what God has shown them. Those you're judging, if you judge, are God's servants. They are not yours to condemn. God will, without your help, take care of their sins if there are sins to be taken care of. He knows their hearts and yours, and he will judge rightly.
Oh no, it's sad, I know we've come to the end of the show.
See you next time.